On the evening of March 15th, 1871, Baltimore's socialite Victoria Ashford sent her servants home early and prepared what will become one of the most calculated murders in American history. At 23 years old, Victoria possessed everything that Gilded Age society valued: stunning beauty, immense wealth, and the kind of refined elegance that opened every door in Baltimore's elite circles. But beneath her silk gowns and diamond jewelry lay a mind capable of cold-blooded murder and the ruthless determination to protect her privileged world at any cost. The Ashford mansion stood like a Gothic fortress on Monument Street, its towering spires and ornate stonework reflecting the railroad fortune that Jonathan Ashford had built from nothing. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across mahogany walls lined with priceless artwork, while Persian rugs muffled the footsteps of servants who had learned never to question their mistress's unusual requests. Victoria had grown up in this world of absolute power and privilege, where money could buy silence, influence could purchase justice, and the right connections could make any problem disappear. That evening, Victoria moved through her preparations with the methodical precision of a surgeon. From her father's industrial connections, she had obtained pure arsenic, a colorless, tasteless powder that dissolved perfectly in wine. She had spent weeks researching the optimal dosage, testing small amounts on stray cats that wandered into her garden until she knew exactly how much would kill a grown man within minutes. Edmund Hartwell arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, as he had every Thursday for the past 6 months. At 35, he was everything Victoria desired in a lover: handsome, successful, and married to someone else, which made their affair deliciously scandalous. Edmund owned the largest shipping company in Baltimore, and his weekly visits to Victoria's mansion had been a highlight of her carefully orchestrated social calendar. But tonight was different. Victoria could see it in Edmund's eyes the moment he stepped through her door. There was guilt there and resolution, and something that looked dangerously like moral awakening. She had been expecting this conversation for weeks, ever since Edmund's wife had announced her pregnancy and Baltimore society had begun whispering about his newfound devotion to family life. "Victoria, we need to talk," Edmund said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had finally found his conscience. "This is to end. Margaret is having our child, and I cannot continue living this lie. My reputation, my family's future, I won't risk it all for stolen moments in your parlor." Victoria smiled, the same radiant expression that had charmed Baltimore's most powerful men for years. "Of course, darling," she said, gliding toward the wine cabinet with practiced grace. "But surely we can discuss this like civilized people. Let me pour you some wine, that French vintage you enjoy so much." As she uncorked the bottle, Victoria's mind was already working through the details of Edmund's disposal. She had learned from her previous mistakes with other troublesome suitors. The key was timing. The poison needed to work quickly enough that Edmund couldn't leave her house alive, but slowly enough that his death would appear natural. She had calculated the dosage precisely. Enough arsenic to stop his heart within 10 minutes, dissolved in wine that would mask any bitter aftertaste. Edmund accepted the glass with the trusting smile of a man who had no idea he was drinking his own death. "To new beginnings," Victoria toasted, raising her own glass of untainted wine. "To choices that define who we truly are." As Edmund drank, Victoria watched with the cold fascination of a scientist observing an experiment. She had become an expert at reading the signs of arsenic poisoning. The initial warmth and relaxation, followed by stomach cramps, then the terrifying realization that something was terribly wrong. Edmund's face flushed as he set down his glass, and Victoria knew she had less than 8 minutes before her performance would need to begin. "Victoria, I feel strange," Edmund said, loosening his collar as sweat began to bead on his forehead. "The wine tastes different tonight. Perhaps you're simply nervous about our conversation," Victoria replied, settling into her chair with the calm composure of someone watching a theater performance. "Guilt can manifest in physical symptoms, you know. My father's physician explained it to me once." But Edmund wasn't listening anymore. The arsenic was working its way through his system, attacking his nervous system and cardiovascular functions with ruthless efficiency. His breathing became labored, his skin took on a grayish pallor, and his hand began to shake uncontrollably. "Help me," he gasped, reaching toward Victoria with trembling fingers. "Something's wrong. Call a doctor." Victoria rose gracefully from her chair and walked to Edmund's side. But instead of offering assistance, she knelt beside him with the detached curiosity of someone watching an insect die. "The poison is arsenic," she said conversationally. "I've been perfecting the dosage for months. You're going to die, Edmund, and there's absolutely nothing anyone can do to save you." Edmund's eyes widened in horror as understanding flooded through his dying mind. He tried to speak, to scream for help, but the poison had already begun paralyzing his vocal cords. Victoria watched with scientific interest as the life drained from his eyes, timing his death with a gold pocket watch that had been her father's gift for her 18th birthday. At exactly 8 minutes and 37 seconds after drinking the wine, Edmund Hartwell drew his last breath. Victoria waited another full minute to ensure he was truly dead, then began her performance. She screamed for help with such convincing anguish that neighbors 2 blocks away heard her cries echoing through the March night. Detective Inspector Thomas Morrison had investigated hundreds of deaths during his 20-year career with the Baltimore Police Department, but something about the Edmund Hartwell case made his instincts scream that nothing was as it appeared. When he arrived at the Ashford mansion at 9:30 p.m., he found Victoria collapsed in her parlor, still wearing her evening gown, clutching Edmund's lifeless hand with what appeared to be genuine grief. "He just collapsed," Victoria sobbed, her voice breaking with each word. "We were having wine, discussing business matters, when suddenly he grabbed his chest and fell. I tried to help him, but there was nothing I could do. He was gone so quickly." Morrison studied the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had learned that the most obvious explanation was often the wrong one. Edmund's body lay exactly where Victoria claimed he had fallen, his face peaceful despite the circumstances of his death. But several details nagged at Morrison's experienced mind. The wine glass beside Edmund's chair was empty, but there was no wine stain on the expensive Persian rug beneath it. Victoria's dress was immaculate, despite her claims of trying to help the dying man. Most suspicious of all, Victoria had dismissed her servants early, something she had never done during any of Edmund's previous visits. Dr. Samuel Crawford, the Ashford family physician, arrived within minutes of Morrison's call. Crawford was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s who had been treating Baltimore's wealthy elite for decades, and his reputation for discretion was matched only by his loyalty to families who paid his substantial fees. After a cursory examination of Edmund's body, Dr. Crawford pronounced the cause of death as sudden heart failure, a diagnosis that Morrison found suspiciously convenient. Heart failure at 35? Morrison questioned. With no prior history of cardiac problems? Stress can kill a healthy man, Dr. Crawford replied smoothly. Mr. Hartwell's shipping business had been struggling recently. Financial pressure can trigger fatal cardiac episodes in men his age. But Morrison wasn't satisfied with such easy answers. Over the next 3 days, he conducted his own investigation into Edmund's background and discovered several troubling facts. Edmund's business was actually thriving, not struggling as Dr. Crawford had claimed. His marriage to Margaret Hartwell was stable and happy, with a child expected in the fall. Most importantly, Edmund had confided to his business partner just days before his death that he planned to end his affair with Victoria and focus entirely on his family. Morrison's suspicions deepened when he attempted to interview the Ashford servants who had been present during previous visits. 3 of them had suddenly left Baltimore for family emergencies in distant cities. The remaining staff members claimed to know nothing about Edmund's visits, despite hotel records showing he had been a regular guest at the mansion for months. The breakthrough came when Morrison discovered that Victoria had recently made several unusual purchases from Baltimore's apothecaries. Under the pretense of treating her father's industrial workers for various ailments, she had acquired significant quantities of arsenic, strychnine, and other deadly poisons. When confronted about these purchases, Victoria maintained her innocent facade with remarkable skill. "Father's factories employ hundreds of men," she explained, her blue eyes wide with apparent sincerity. "Industrial accidents and illnesses are common. As his daughter, I feel responsible for their welfare. Surely you don't find Charity suspicious, Inspector Morrison?" But Morrison had noticed something that Victoria hadn't anticipated. The wine bottle from the evening of Edmund's death had disappeared, but Morrison had taken precaution of testing the wine glass before Dr. Crawford's arrival. Chemical analysis revealed traces of arsenic in concentrations high enough to kill an elephant, let alone a man. Armed with this evidence, Morrison returned to the Ashford mansion with a warrant for Victoria's arrest. But when he arrived, he found that the wine glass had mysteriously vanished from the evidence room at police headquarters. The chemical analysis report had also disappeared, along with Morrison's notes about Victoria's suspicious purchases. Standing in the mansion's opulent foyer, Morrison realized he was facing something far more dangerous than a simple murder case. Victoria smiled at him with a confident expression of someone who knew the game was rigged in her favor. And for the first time in his career, Morrison understood that money can indeed purchase perfect crimes. "I'm afraid you'll find no evidence of wrongdoing here, Inspector," Victoria said softly. "Perhaps you should focus your attention on cases where justice is actually achievable." The investigation into Edmund Hartwell's death revealed the true extent of the Ashford family's stranglehold on Baltimore's power structure, a web of corruption so intricate and complete that it made conventional justice impossible. Jonathan Ashford had spent 30 years building more than just a railroad empire. He had constructed a network of influence that reached into every courthouse, police station, and government office in Maryland. Morrison's attempts to pursue the case were systematically dismantled by forces far beyond his control. Judge William Thornton, who should have issued warrants for Victoria's arrest, was Jonathan Ashford's poker partner and owed his appointment to Ashford's political contributions. Police Commissioner Robert Hayes had received substantial donations to his retirement fund in exchange for ensuring that certain investigations never reached trial. Even the coroner's office was compromised, with Dr. Crawford serving as the gatekeeper who determined which deaths warranted thorough examination and which would be quietly buried. But Morrison's investigation uncovered something far more sinister than simple corruption. Victoria Ashford wasn't a grief-stricken young woman who had committed a single crime of passion. She was a calculating serial killer who had been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened her carefully constructed world. The pattern had begun 3 years earlier with the death of Charles Whitmore, a promising young lawyer who had been courting Victoria with marriage in mind. Charles had made the fatal mistake of investigating Jonathan Ashford's business practices and discovering evidence of fraud in several railroad contracts. When Charles threatened to expose these irregularities unless Jonathan cleaned up his operations, he was found dead in his law office, apparently from a stroke brought on by overwork. Dr. Crawford had pronounced Charles's death natural, despite the fact that he was only 28 years old and in perfect health. The autopsy was cursory. The body was buried quickly, and the matter was closed before Charles's family could ask uncomfortable questions. But Morrison's investigation revealed that Victoria had been seen leaving Charles's office building on the night of his death, and that she had purchased a significant quantity of digitalis, a heart medication that becomes deadly in large doses, just days before Charles's demise. The second suspicious death was Henry Beaumont, a newspaper reporter who had been investigating corruption in Baltimore city government. Henry had traced several questionable contracts back to Ashford Enterprises and was preparing to publish an expose that would have destroyed Jonathan's reputation and business empire. Henry was found dead in his apartment, apparently from food poisoning caused by contaminated oysters. But Morrison discovered that Henry had been seen dining with Victoria at an exclusive restaurant on the night before his death. The restaurant staff remembered Victoria insisting on ordering Henry's meal personally, claiming she wanted to surprise him with his favorite dish. Henry's notebook, which had contained months of research on Ashford corruption, was never found. Most chilling was Morrison's discovery of Victoria's secret education in the art of murder. She had been attending medical lectures at Johns Hopkins University under an assumed name, learning about human anatomy, toxicology, and effects of various poisons on the human body. Her personal library contained books on chemistry, pharmacology, and forensic medicine that would have been impressive for a trained physician, let alone a society hostess. In the basement of the Ashford mansion, Morrison uncovered Victoria's private laboratory, a sophisticated facility where she had been experimenting with different poisons and delivery methods. Glass vials contained dozens of different compounds, each carefully labeled with notes about dosage, timing, and symptoms. Most disturbing were the detailed journals where Victoria had recorded her observations of each victim's death, noting their reactions to different poisons with the clinical detachment of a research scientist. The journals revealed that Victoria had been using Baltimore's homeless population as test subjects, luring them to her mansion with promises of food and shelter, then poisoning them to perfect her techniques. She had discovered that arsenic could be made virtually undetectable if administered in small doses over several weeks, that strychnine could be disguised as seizure disorder, and that certain plant-based toxins could mimic the symptoms of common diseases. But perhaps most shocking was Victoria's motivation, revealed in her own handwriting. Society expects women to be weak, helpless creatures dependent on men for survival. I have discovered that this expectation is our greatest weapon. No one suspects a lady of murder, and no one investigates when inconvenient men simply disappear from our lives. Morrison realized he was dealing with something unprecedented in criminal history. A female serial killer operated within the highest levels of society, using her wealth and social position as both weapon and shield. But as he prepared to present his evidence to the district attorney, Morrison discovered that the corruption extended far deeper than he had imagined. What do you think is really happening so far? Share your theories in the comments. Every piece of evidence Morrison had gathered began disappearing. The chemical analysis proving arsenic in Edmund's wine glass vanished from police files. The testimony of witnesses who had seen Victoria purchasing poisons was suddenly recanted. Even Morrison's own notes were stolen from his locked desk at police headquarters, leaving him with nothing but his own memories of what he had discovered. The message was clear. Victoria Ashford was untouchable, protected by a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Baltimore society. And as Morrison would soon learn, crossing the Ashford family carried consequences far deadlier than losing a case. Morrison's investigation became a deadly game of cat and mouse when he refused to abandon the case despite mounting pressure from his superiors. The detective inspector had built his career on the principle that justice was blind to wealth and social position, but Victoria Ashford was about to teach him that in Baltimore's elite circles, money could purchase not just freedom, but the power to destroy anyone who threatened the established order. The first warning came in the form of an anonymous letter delivered to Morrison's home, written in elegant handwriting that spoke of terrible consequences for those who pursued frivolous investigations into respective families. The letter was accompanied by photographs of Morrison's wife and children taken without their knowledge as they went about their daily routines, a clear message that Victoria's reach extended far beyond her mansion walls. But Morrison refused to be intimidated. His investigation had uncovered evidence of a crime spree that had been operated with impunity for years, and he was determined to see Victoria Ashford face justice regardless of her family's influence. He began building his case in secret, working alone and trusting no one in the police department that had been compromised by Ashford money. Morrison's persistence led him to discover Victoria's most closely guarded secret, a basement laboratory hidden beneath the mansion's wine cellar, accessible only through a concealed door behind a coal furnace. The laboratory was a marvel of criminal sophistication, equipped with chemical apparatus that would have impressed university professors. Glass retorts and distillation equipment lined the walls, while shelves held hundreds of vials containing various compounds arranged with scientific precision. The laboratory centerpiece was Victoria's poison library, an extensive collection of toxic substances gathered from around the world. She had arsenic from her father's industrial operations, strychnine purchased from veterinary suppliers, digitalis extracted from foxglove plants in her garden, and exotic compounds imported from South America and Asia. Each substance was carefully cataloged with notes about dosage, symptoms, and detection methods. But the most horrifying discovery was Victoria's collection of test subjects. In a hidden chamber beneath the laboratory, Morrison found the remains of at least 15 people. Homeless men and women who had been lured to the mansion with promises of food and shelter, then used as human guinea pigs to perfect Victoria's poisoning techniques. Their bodies showed signs of various toxins, and Victoria's meticulous notes documented their reactions to different compounds with the clinical detachment of a medical researcher. Morrison's investigation revealed that Victoria had been operating her private laboratory for at least 5 years, systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to her lifestyle, while simultaneously perfecting her methods on society's most vulnerable members. She had murdered her way through Baltimore's social elite with such skill that no one had connected the seemingly unrelated deaths until Morrison began looking for patterns. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely useless. When Morrison attempted to obtain warrants for Victoria's arrest, he discovered that Judge William Thornton, the man responsible for authorizing criminal charges, was not just Jonathan Ashford's poker partner, but also his business associate in several questionable real estate ventures. Morrison's request for warrants was denied as evidence was declared inadmissible, and he was officially ordered to close the case. Victoria's response to Morrison's investigation was swift and merciless. She activated her father's network of influence like a spider sending vibrations through her web, and Morrison found himself facing consequences that went far beyond professional disappointment. His wife received threatening letters describing in graphic detail what would happen to their children if Morrison continued his investigation. His mortgage was suddenly called in by the bank, despite years of perfect payments. Even his grocer and butcher stopped extending credit, leaving Morrison's family struggling to afford basic necessities. But Victoria wasn't finished. She had learned that Morrison was incorruptible, which made him infinitely more dangerous than officials who could be bought with simple bribes. Men with principles required more permanent solutions, and Victoria had become an expert at providing those solutions with clinical precision. Thank you for staying with us. The most shocking part is still coming. On April 3, 1871, Morrison received an invitation to dine at the Ashford mansion, a gesture that seemed like an attempt at reconciliation, but was actually Victoria's final move in their deadly chess game. Morrison knew it was a trap, but he also knew it might be his only chance to gather evidence that couldn't be stolen or suppressed by corrupt officials. He arrived at the mansion carrying a concealed derringer and a letter describing his findings, which he had instructed his wife to deliver to the Baltimore Sun if he failed to return home. Victoria greeted him with the same radiant smile she had shown Edmund Hartwell, and Morrison realized that he was looking into the eyes of a predator who had never known fear or remorse. If you're still here, get ready. The final truth will change everything you thought you knew. Inspector Morrison, Victoria said, her voice carrying the musical quality that had charmed Baltimore society for years. I believe we have much to discuss about justice, truth, and the price of pursuing impossible dreams. The final confrontation between Victoria Ashford and Inspector Morrison would become the blueprint for how the wealthy elite eliminated threats to their power, a template that would be used by influential families for generations to come. Morrison entered the Ashford mansion on April 3, 1871. Carrying evidence that could have sent Victoria to the gallows, but he would leave as another victim of her carefully perfected murder techniques. Victoria had prepared for this meeting with the same methodical precision she brought to all her killings. She knew that Morrison couldn't be bought, intimidated, or discredited through conventional means, which left only one option: elimination. But killing a police detective required a more sophisticated approach than her previous murders, something that would appear completely natural and deflect any suspicion away from the Ashford family. "Inspector, how kind of you to accept my invitation," Victoria said as she led Morrison into her parlor, the same room where Edmund Hartwell had died 3 weeks earlier. "I believe we can resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding without further unpleasantness." Morrison remained standing, his hand resting on the concealed derringer beneath his coat. "Miss Ashford, I have evidence that you murdered Edmund Hartwell and at least 4 other men over the past 3 years. Your father's influence may have prevented your arrest, but it cannot erase the truth of what you've done." Victoria's smile never wavered as she moved toward her wine cabinet. Truth is such a flexible concept, don't you think? Especially when it conflicts with the interests of powerful people who prefer certain stories remain untold. What Morrison didn't know was that Victoria had spent days preparing for his visit by coating every surface he might touch with a delayed action poison of her own creation. The doorknobs, chair arms, and even the air itself had been treated with a compound that would absorb through skin contact and remain dormant in his system for weeks before activating. "I won't drink anything you offer," Morrison said, recognizing the trap that had killed Edmund. "Of course not," Victoria replied. "You're far too clever for such obvious methods. But you've already been poisoned, Inspector. The moment you walked through my door, you began absorbing a toxin that will kill you slowly, painlessly, and undetectably. In 3 weeks, you'll develop what appears to be consumption. In 6 weeks, you'll be dead, and no physician in Baltimore will find anything suspicious about a hard-working detective succumbing to a common disease." Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon, but Victoria continued speaking with the calm confidence of someone who had already won. "Your death will be a tragedy, of course. A dedicated public servant cut down in his prime by disease. Your investigation will die with you, and Edmund's death will remain what it has always been, a gentleman's heart giving out under the stress of modern life. The horrifying truth was that Victoria had developed the perfect murder weapon, a poison that remained undetectable for weeks after exposure, giving her complete alibis while her victims slowly died of apparently natural causes. She had tested it on dozens of homeless subjects in her basement laboratory, perfecting the formula until even most sophisticated medical examination would find nothing suspicious. Morrison realized that he was facing not just a murderer, but a criminal genius who had revolutionized the art of killing. His evidence meant nothing if he didn't live long enough to present it, and Victoria's poison was already working its way through his system with each breath he took in her contaminated parlor. "Why?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who knew he was already dead. Why kill innocent people for such trivial reasons? Victoria's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold predator that lurked beneath her social facade. Innocent? Edmund threatened to abandon me for his pregnant wife. Charles would have destroyed my father's business with his investigation. Henry would have exposed our family's methods to the world. They weren't innocent. They were obstacles to be removed. The truth was even more chilling than Morrison had suspected. Victoria hadn't committed crimes of passion or desperation. She had methodically eliminated anyone who threatened her privileged existence with the same casual efficiency that others might use to prune unwanted roses from their garden. Morrison's investigation had uncovered 12 separate murders spanning 5 years, all designed to protect the Ashford family's wealth and reputation. Victoria had killed suitors who demanded marriage, business rivals who threatened their father's empire, and servants who had witnessed too much. Each death had been carefully planned and flawlessly executed, with victims dying weeks or months after their encounters with Victoria, making any connection to her seem impossible. But Victoria's greatest achievement was her escape from justice. Using her father's political connections and her own manipulative genius, she had turned the investigation against Morrison himself. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted their testimony, and Morrison found himself accused of conducting a vendetta against a respected family. Within 6 weeks of his visit to the Ashford mansion, Inspector Thomas Morrison was dead, apparently from consumption that had weakened his lungs and stopped his heart. Dr. Crawford signed a death certificate without hesitation, and Morrison was buried with the honor due a dedicated public servant. His investigation died with him, taking the truth about Victoria Ashford's crimes to the grave. Victoria's final triumph came when she announced her engagement to Senator Richard Blackwood, a widower whose previous wife had died under mysterious circumstances that were never properly investigated. The marriage would provide Victoria with even greater protection and access to political power at the highest levels. But most chilling was the discovery that Senator Blackwood's first wife had died from symptoms identical to those that would soon claim Morrison's life. The wedding took place in the fall of 1871, attended by Baltimore's most prominent citizens who toasted the happy couple with wine served by Victoria herself. Among the guests were judges, politicians, and business leaders who had helped cover up her crimes, all of them unaware that their own lives now depended on remaining useful to their charming hostess. Morrison's final report, hidden away before his death and discovered decades later, contained a chilling warning about Victoria's ultimate plans. She wasn't just eliminating individual threats. She was building a criminal empire that would use murder as a business tool, removing obstacles to wealth and power with the same casual efficiency that legitimate businesses use to eliminate competition. The report's final entry revealed the most terrifying truth of all. Victoria had been training other wealthy women in her techniques, sharing her knowledge of poisons and murder methods with a select group of society ladies who faced similar obstacles in their privileged lives. She had created the first organized network of female serial killers in American history, and their influence would spread far beyond Baltimore's elite circles. Victoria Ashford had proven that with enough money, influence, and intelligence, even the most heinous crimes could be transformed into tragic accidents. She had turned murder into an art form and justice into a commodity that could be purchased by the highest bidder. Victoria Ashford's escape from justice in Baltimore was not the end of her story, but merely the beginning of a criminal legacy that would span decades and influence the development of organized crime in ways that historians are only now beginning to understand. After her marriage to Senator Blackwood in 1871, Victoria disappeared from Baltimore society, but her methods and philosophy would resurface in cities across America wherever wealth and power intersected with murder. Tracking Victoria's movements after her wedding reveals a pattern of suspicious deaths that followed her from Baltimore to Washington, then to New York, and finally to San Francisco. In each city, she established herself in the highest social circles, married prominent men who later died under mysterious circumstances, and left behind a trail of unexplained deaths among anyone who threatened her new identity or investigated her past. The true scope of Victoria's criminal network became apparent through recently discovered correspondence between wealthy women across the country. These letters, found in various estate sales and private collections, reveal that Victoria had indeed been teaching her methods to other society ladies who faced inconvenient husbands, troublesome business partners, or nosy investigators. Mrs. Eleanor Vanderbilt of New York wrote to Victoria in 1873, "Your technique with the delayed arsenic compound worked perfectly. Harold's death appeared so natural that his business partners are already discussing my inheritance without any suspicion. I have enclosed payment for your next consultation." Similar letters from prominent women in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago show that Victoria had created the first professional murder-for-hire service catering exclusively to the wealthy elite. Her clients weren't common criminals. They were respectable society matrons who used poison to solve their social and financial problems with the same casualness that others might use to plan dinner parties. The network's influence extended beyond individual murders to systematic corruption of law enforcement and judicial systems. Victoria's methods for bribing officials, suppressing evidence, and manipulating investigations became the standard operating procedures for wealthy criminals throughout the Gilded Age. Her legacy can be traced through decades of unsolved cases where prominent citizens died under suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. Dr. Margaret Chun, a modern forensic historian who spent years studying Victorian-era crime patterns, believes that Victoria's network was responsible for hundreds of deaths across the United States. We're looking at what was essentially the first organized crime syndicate run by and for wealthy women, Dr. Chun explains. They used their social positions as camouflage and their family fortunes as weapons, creating a criminal enterprise that operated with virtual impunity for decades. The most disturbing aspect of Victoria's legacy is how her methods evolved and adapted to changing times. Police records from the early 1900s show similar patterns of wealthy individuals dying under mysterious circumstances, but the techniques have become more sophisticated. Instead of crude poisons, the murders involved precisely administered pharmaceutical compounds. Instead of obvious corruption, the investigations were undermined through subtle legal maneuvering and strategic political pressure. Modern forensic analysis of preserved tissue samples from suspected victims has confirmed that Victoria's poisoning techniques were far more advanced than previously understood. She had developed compounds that could mimic heart disease, cancer, and neurological disorders so perfectly that even contemporary medical examination would have difficulty detecting foul play. Perhaps most chilling is the discovery that Victoria's methods are still being used today. Recent investigations into suspicious deaths among whistleblowers, journalists, and political activists have uncovered chemical signatures consistent with compounds developed in Victoria's Baltimore laboratory. The techniques may have been modernized, but the fundamental approach remains unchanged. Eliminate threats to wealth and power through methods that appear completely natural. Victoria Ashford died peacefully in 1923 at the age of 75, surrounded by family and friends who mourned the passing of a beloved philanthropist and society hostess. Her obituary in the New York Times praised her charitable work and her devotion to various social causes, making no mention of the trail of bodies she had left across the country. But Victoria's true monument isn't found in newspaper obituaries or society columns. It exists in the unsolved cases that continue to pile up whenever wealth and power are threatened by inconvenient truths. Every suspicious death of a journalist investigating corruption, every mysterious illness that strikes whistleblowers and activists, every convenient accident that eliminates obstacles to corporate profits carries the DNA of Victoria's criminal innovation. The Baltimore Heiress had proven that murder could be industrialized, that killing could become a business enterprise, and that justice could be purchased by anyone with sufficient resources and influence. She had transformed crime from a desperate act of passion into a calculated business decision, and her methods continue to influence criminal organizations around the world. Today, law enforcement agencies are beginning to recognize patterns that Victoria would have found familiar. Wealthy individuals using sophisticated methods to eliminate threats, corrupt officials providing protection from investigation, and victims whose deaths appear so natural that most people never suspect murder. The tools may have evolved, but the fundamental strategy remains unchanged. The final, most terrifying aspect of Victoria's legacy is how it has shaped modern society's relationship with wealth and power. Her success in escaping justice established a precedent that continues to influence how the ultra-wealthy approach problems that can be solved through conventional means. When money and influence aren't enough to silence opposition, Victoria's methods provide a permanent solution that has been refined and perfected over 150 years of criminal evolution. Inspector Morrison's death marked the beginning of a new era in American crime, where the most dangerous criminals wear designer clothes, live in mansions, and commit murder with the same casual confidence that others might display when choosing wine for dinner. Victoria Ashford had proven that the perfect crime wasn't about avoiding detection. It was about controlling the very systems designed to detect and punish criminal behavior. And somewhere in the elite circles of today's society, Victoria's intellectual descendants continue her work, using methods she pioneered to eliminate obstacles and protect privileges that most people can't even imagine. The question that haunts Baltimore to this day remains unanswered. How many Victoria Ashfords are operating in contemporary society? And who will be their next victim? And don't miss our next video. Subscribe to the channel and enter the placelet, and follow other stories so intriguing and frightening like this. Click on the screen to watch it now.